The street smelled of cordite and wet stone. Sirius had been standing in it for perhaps 3 seconds, or perhaps 3 years. He had come here with his hands open and his head empty. That was the only way he had been able to move since leaving Godric's Hollow. Hands open, head empty, because the alternative was to stop, and if he stopped, he would have to feel what was underneath the movement. And he already knew, at some animal level, that there was nothing survivable underneath. So he had tracked Peter through the pre-dawn grey, through the back alleys of a London district he'd known since school, had tracked him the same way he tracked every quarry in his Auror training, methodically, without thinking, because methodology was a kind of mercy. He had seen the ruins of the cottage and left because looking was a thing he could not sustain, and coming here was the only direction that remained. Peter was here. Sirius had felt it in the way he felt all of Pettigrew's places, with a faint revulsion, like a scent too sweet left in a closed room. The street around him was ordinary. A November morning, early enough that the Muggles were mostly still in their houses, a handful of bleary figures on their way to work, a newsagent with its lights on, a woman in a red coat waiting at the bus stop, her breath clouding white. 12 faces, more or less. Sirius counted them out of habit, the reflex of a trained Auror in an unfamiliar space. He did not get to finish counting. Peter came out from between 2 parked cars. He didn't look surprised. He had been waiting then, expecting pursuit, or perhaps expecting precisely this. Precisely Sirius. Sirius registered it in the fractured, underwater way. He had registered everything since last night, each piece arriving slightly delayed, like sound after lightning. Peter's face, the familiar fear in it that had lived there since they were 11 years old and was only now, finally, legible for what it actually was, not shyness, not smallness, the terror of someone who had already decided to save himself. "Sirius," Peter said, and his voice came out like a wail, carrying and perfectly pitched. "Sirius, how could you?" Sirius had time to understand that this was a performance. He did not have time to move. Peter's wand came up from his sleeve, the motion quick and practiced in a way that Sirius had never seen in 12 years of knowing him, which told him something important and terrible about how long Peter had been rehearsing this, and then the street behind Peter's own body tore itself apart. The explosion was not a bolt of light or an aimed curse. It was a rending. The pavement heaved upward and outward, stone and glass and metal fragmenting in every direction. Sirius was knocked backward by the force of it, his ears going silent with the pressure of it. He lay on his back in the rubble. The woman in the red coat was simply gone. The bus stop was gone. He breathed in and breathed out, and 12 mouths that had been doing the same 30 seconds ago were no longer doing anything at all. He knew, lying there, that he would have to count them later. He would have to count every one and know them as people, and carry them, but not yet. Peter. He scrambled upright, chest heaving, and scanned the wreckage. The smoke was thick and tasted of ash and brick dust. Somewhere in it, a single object caught the early light, a finger, a severed finger, lying on a piece of broken pavement where no body would be found. The rest of Peter Pettigrew had already gone into the sewer. Sirius had heard it, a soft, unmistakable sound in the drain beside the curb, barely audible beneath the ringing in his ears, already irretrievable, already gone, already vermin in the pipes of London, exactly as he had always been. Sirius stood in the crater. Around him, people were shouting. He heard the crack of apparition, ministry speed, 3 distinct arrivals in the span of 2 seconds, auras. An explosion of this size in a Muggle residential street at 6 in the morning would have tripped every monitoring ward the ministry maintained. The laughter rose. He felt it begin in his chest and climb toward his throat. He knew this laugh. He had felt it in the aftermath of James's worst pranks, laughing until he could not breathe, because there was no other adequate response to certain kinds of absurdity, the kind that were too enormous to fit inside any normal emotional container. What Peter had just done had that same quality. 12 dead people and a severed finger and Pettigrew in a sewer, having spent 12 years eating off their plates and sleeping in their dormitory and holding baby Harry at James's birthday dinner. It was so absurd that the only available response was the laugh that had no humor in it. The laughter reached his throat and stopped. Something happened in the space between his chest and his mouth. Some cold and very specific part of him, the part that had made him useful as an auror, the part that had tracked Pettigrew through dark streets without stopping, the part that ran on pure tactical clarity when everything else was on fire, that part said, he had done nothing. He had killed no one. Peter's finger was in the rubble. Peter was in the sewer. These were facts. Facts that could be established if anyone chose to look, if Sirius gave them a reason to look, rather than standing in a crater full of dead muggles with laughter on his face. He had lent his motorcycle to Hagrid before coming here, because getting Harry clear had seemed more important than his own escape. He had come here, on foot, hands open, to get the truth, and now the truth was a severed finger in a pile of rubble, and he was the only person alive who knew it. He did not laugh. The silence that replaced it was stranger than the laughter would have been. 3 auras materialized out of the smoke, wands drawn moving in the defensive spread he recognized as standard approach. He raised his hands, both of them empty, palm out. He had left his wand in his pocket, and he did not reach for it. He kept his face as still as he could make it. Sirius Black, the first aura said, not a question. Yes. You are under arrest on suspicion of, I am Sirius Black. He said it loudly, clearly, loudly enough to carry across the wreckage and the smoke and the muggle faces now pressed to their windows. Not a shout. He used his aura voice, the one trained to be heard and remembered, the one that cut through noise. I am Sirius Black. I demand Veritaserum. Administer it here or at the ministry, in front of witnesses, before any sentence is pronounced. The first auror's hand tightened on his wand. The second auror said quietly, Hold on. He was younger than the other two, and he had the look of someone who had just calculated something quickly and was uncomfortable with what he'd found. He was scanning the street, the muggle witnesses behind their windows, his own communication orb already glowing in his coat pocket. Sirius. He made that demand publicly, the second auror said to his colleague. There are civilian witnesses. It needs to go on record before we proceed. The first auror said something low and sharp. The second auror was already drawing out the orb, already speaking into it, a ministry documentation charm, standard procedure for contested arrests, one that Sirius himself had initiated a dozen times and that he now recognized as the most important thing currently happening within 50 yards of this crater. Not the arrest. The record, the demand existed on ministry record. Now it had been witnessed, it had been spoken, in the presence of 6 ministry auras and however many muggles would need to be obliviated before morning. The third auror restrained him, standard binding both wrists, a firm hand on his shoulder. Professional. Sirius did not resist. He went quietly, which he could tell surprised the auror from the slight hesitation in the grip. The man had braced for a fight, and there wasn't one. Sirius looked back over his shoulder as they walked him away from the crater, back toward the edge of the cordon the aurors were already establishing. The finger was still there in the rubble. One adult male finger, severed cleanly, lying on a piece of broken pavement where no body would ever be found. The truth existed here. It was physical. It was small and pale and unremarkable, and it was the most important thing on this street. He held on to that the way he held on to the thought of Harry in Hagrid's arms, riding south on Sirius's own borrowed motorcycle, alive, out of there, safe enough for now. Not comfort, exactly, but something to hold, and right now something was enough. He walked. He did not look back a second time. The Ministry atrium was joy, and Bartemius Crouch moved through it the way he moved through everything else, without stopping, without looking sideways, without conceding that the people crowding the gilded space had any particular claim on his attention. They were celebrating. Of course they were celebrating. The war was over. Voldemort was gone, apparently destroyed by an infant, by a child not yet 2 years old, which was a detail that Crouch had turned over during the walk from the Floo terminal and then deliberately set aside because the detail, while worth examining later, was not useful to him now. What was useful now was the work. There was always work, and tonight the work was considerable. He moved through the press of Ministry employees who had no business being on duty at this hour. Junior clerks were embracing in the corridors. An aura he recognized from level 2 had tears on her face, which Crouch registered and immediately filed under. Not his concern. A junior administrator from the Department of Magical Transportation blocked his path for a moment and said something about a great day. Something about a victory. Crouch agreed that it was, which was both true and the fastest way to get the man out of his way. Someone offered him a glass of something amber and fizzing. He did not break stride. His office was on level 2. It was quiet. It smelled of parchment and flue ash and the particular institutional dryness of air that had been magically regulated for decades. He hung his outer robe on the hook behind the door with the precise care he gave to everything, sat at his desk, pressed his fingertips together, and waited. The first communication orb resolved almost immediately. Ministry Auror Channels Field Report, Priority Classification. He lifted it. A senior Auror from the arrest site in North London, reporting in Sirius Black in custody. The scene. Catastrophic. 12 Muggle bystanders killed by a single enormous blast. Evidence consistent with a casting from the suspect's location. Suspect did not resist arrest. Crouch set down the orb and began to write. Sirius Black of the House of Black, which told him most of what he needed to know about the blood prejudices the man had been raised in and had apparently, per the evidence, acted upon. Best friend of James Potter, a decorated Auror himself, which was an uncomfortable fact, but war frequently produced uncomfortable facts, and the job was not to flinch from them, but to categorize them correctly. Charged with 13 Muggle deaths, disclosure of the Potter's location to Voldemort, service as a Death Eater operative. The physical evidence at the scene was consistent with all 3 charges. Under emergency wartime powers, no trial was required. The directive was simple, his signature, a transport order, Azkaban. He drew a fresh sheet of parchment toward him and uncapped his pen. The second orb pulsed before he had written a word. He lifted it with the precise, controlled impatience he brought to all interruptions. The voice this time was younger, one of the field team's auras, and the careful, almost apologetic cadence of the report told Crouch, before the content arrived, that what was coming would be inconvenient. The man reported prior to being restrained. Sirius Black had made a verbal declaration at the arrest site, made clearly at a volume that carried. in the presence of 6 ministry auras and an unspecified number of Muggle witnesses who were at that moment being obliviated. The declaration had been captured by a ministry documentation charm. "Read it," Crouch said. The aura read it. Crouch listened. He set down the second orb. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the surface of the desk. His office walls were covered in the documentation of 8 months of wartime emergency administration, wanted notices, operational maps, arrest logs, aligned with such precision they might have been placed with instruments. He had run the Department of Magical Law Enforcement through the worst period of organized magical violence in British history, and he had run it without sentiment and without hesitation, and the ministry had survived. He had authorized auras to use whatever means the situation required. He had sent men and women to Azkaban without trials, and he had done so on the correct understanding that procedural niceties were a luxury of peacetime, and the peacetime was not yet. He did not apologize for any of it. A formal demand for Veritaserum, witnessed, made publicly in the presence of 6 ministry representatives and a street full of Muggles. That demand did not dissolve simply because it was inconvenient. A ministry legal advisor would flag it. He already had a third orb sat on Crouch's desk, pulsing amber, and Crouch had noticed it when he came in and had known already that it contained the opinion he was now going to have to read. He had been, as of tonight, the subject of increasingly explicit discussion in ministry corridors. As the likely successor to Minister Bagnold, he was aware of this. He was aware of it the way a man is aware of a large object in his peripheral vision. He did not look directly at it, because looking directly at it was a form of presumption that could be weaponized against him, but he never lost track of precisely where it was. A clean conviction of Sirius Black, James Potter's traitor, one of the architects of 13 civilian deaths on a public street, was politically useful. It was the right ending to a war that the ministry had fought and apparently won, and a decisive DMLE head who moved swiftly to close a high-profile case came out of that ending rather well. A conviction obtained by a ministry official who had, on record, received a formal Veritaserum request and overridden it, that told a story Crouch had no interest in becoming, not because he was wrong to override it. He was not wrong to override it. He was entirely within his authority, but authority exercised visibly, in ways that could later be characterized as expedient, was a vulnerability, and Crouch had not reached this desk by tolerating vulnerabilities. He lifted the third orb, denned. He read the legal advisory opinion, which said, in the measured and deferential language his advisors reliably used when they were delivering disagreeable news, that a formal Veritaserum request made publicly in the presence of ministry personnel, and that summary sentencing prior to resolution of that procedural matter carried non-trivial institutional risk. He set down the third orb. He would not deny the demand. Denial was a larger problem than delay. Delay was manageable. Delay was, in fact, simply filing the matter under the correct heading and closing the drawer until the appropriate moment. He pulled the parchment forward again and wrote, Sirius Black, currently in ministry custody, pending scheduling of a summary proceeding. Not a full Wizengamot trial, a proceeding. Crouch made the distinction, and the distinction was his to make, and he intended to keep it. He signed it, sealed it, and sent it through ministry dispatch in a small burst of silver flame. He was not troubled by what he had set in motion. He had not been troubled by the machinery of his own decisions in a long time, which was perhaps something to examine, but not tonight. He stood. He put on his coat. Below him, 3 floors of ministry jubilation went on without requiring his participation. Somewhere over the English countryside, moving through pre-dawn cold on a borrowed motorbike with the throttle fully open, Rubeus Hagrid held an infant Harry Potter against his chest with the careful terror of a man who was accustomed to dangerous things but had rarely held anything quite so small or quite so important. The motorcycle was Sirius Black's. Sirius had lent it to Hagrid before going to find Peter Pettigrew, which meant if anyone had been in a position to notice that a man who had supposedly planned to betray his best friends and flee had instead handed away his primary means of flight and walked to his confrontation on foot, Crouch was not in a position to notice this. He did not yet know it was a fact worth noticing. He turned off the light. He went home through a ministry still bright with other people's relief. Hagrid had been flying for 4 hours when little whinging came up below him in the dark. 4 hours with the boy in his arms and the cold coming through his jacket in ways a jacket that size had no business allowing. 4 hours in which he had thought about a great many things, mostly things he should not be thinking about. The cottage, the door that had been blasted off its hinges, the way the inside of the place had looked, and had decided each time not to think about them. He thought instead about the weight of the boy against his chest, which was warm and steady in a way that Hagrid found he needed. 15 months old. Heavy for 15 months, which was good. Babies should be heavy. He'd held plenty of creatures smaller than Harry that had weighed considerably more and needed considerably more careful handling, and none of them had his hair or his Hagrid cut the thought off before he got to the end of it. The hair was James's hair. He did not want to think about James's hair right now, and so he thought instead about the wind and the altitude and the job, which was to get the boy safely to Dumbledore, and then the job would be done and Hagrid could go somewhere quiet and private and be as wrecked about all of it as he actually was. Not yet. The motorcycle came down in a rush of engine noise and cold air onto a street that was to all appearances exactly like every other street in Little Whinging, identical houses in identical rows, identical gardens, identical quiet. Hagrid had always found this kind of place faintly unsettling. All that sameness, all that determined ordinariness. But tonight it was different. Tonight the sameness looked like safety, and safety for Harry was what they were here for. Professor McGonagall was on a garden wall. He almost missed her, a tabby cat, sitting perfectly still in the dark, with square spectacle markings around her eyes. And then she dropped to the pavement, and became Professor McGonagall again, and he still found it a start, even knowing it was coming. Her expression was the one she wore when she had spent a long time in a disagreeable situation, and was prepared to say so at length. "Hagrid!" She said it as though she was checking a fact she already knew. Her eyes went directly to Harry, who was asleep against Hagrid's chest, one small fist pressed to Hagrid's collar. "He's all right," Hagrid said, which was all he could say. "Where is Dumbledore?" "Said he'd be along." McGonagall pressed her lips together and said nothing. Hagrid stood in the road with the boy and watched the dark end of the street, and 2 minutes later Dumbledore was there. Not arriving dramatically, just suddenly present in the way he was, tall and silver-bearded in robes that caught no light, because the light had already been gathered up and put away in the small silver device in his left hand. He stood for a long moment, looking at Harry. "He is unharmed," Dumbledore said. "Not quite a question." "Yes, sir. The scar?" "Yes, sir." Dumbledore reached out and touched the top of Harry's head, briefly, a gesture with no audience in it, quiet and private, and Hagrid found a spot on the garden wall to look at until it was finished. McGonagall said, "I have been here since this morning, Albus, all day watching that family. They are the worst sort of muggles. No warmth, no curiosity, not a flicker of anything beyond their own small concerns." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "Then you understand my concern. "Surely there are, Minerva." He said it gently, which was somehow final in a way that raised voices never managed to be. He moved to the bottom of the porch steps and did something Hagrid had never seen him do. He sat down on them, right there, on the cold concrete, and drew parchment and a quill from his robes, and began to write. As though sitting on a stranger's doorstep in the small hours of a November morning was a perfectly ordinary way to compose a letter. McGonagall watched him with the expression of someone who has lost an argument and intends to raise it again at the earliest possible opportunity. The quill moved. The street was very quiet. "You are certain," McGonagall said. "Not an accusation, just certain." "The wards require her blood," Dumbledore said without looking up. "There is no other anchor for what Lily created. I would give him a different life if the magic permitted it, and it does not." Hagrid looked up at the sky. It was very dark, with a few stars between the clouds, and he thought about James briefly, and then stopped thinking about James because there was a limit to what he could hold in his chest at one time, and he was very close to it. Then a shape came through the dark of the street, silver, moving like light through still water. A Ministry Patronus Hagrid's hand was already on his umbrella before he recognized it for what it was. It stopped at Dumbledore's shoulder and delivered its message in someone else's voice, clipped and formal. "Sirius Black in custody. Formal demand made publicly at the arrest site before any sentence pronounced." The voice finished. The shape dissolved. The quill went still. 3 seconds. Dumbledore sat on the front step of a house that was not his, and held a letter he had nearly finished, and the night held its shape around them. Hagrid looked at McGonagall, and McGonagall was looking at Dumbledore, and Dumbledore was looking at the letter with an expression that Hagrid could not quite read from where he stood. "Albus," McGonagall said quietly. "He may be innocent," Dumbledore said. "The demand, if honored, may prove it." He paused. "That does not change what Lily's magic requires. The blood ward must be anchored in her blood, in her sister, in this house. That is not a preference of mine. That is the nature of the charm, and the charm is the only protection the boy has. And if he is exonerated," McGonagall said, "you will have placed Harry with these people before the trial concluded, without legal authority." "I will have acted to protect him," Dumbledore said. "Those are not always the same thing, Minerva, and I have made my peace with that distinction." He finished the letter. He folded it. He stood. Hagrid transferred Harry to Dumbledore's arms, which was a thing he found harder than expected. Not because of the weight, but because of the handing over of it, the giving up of the warm, small heaviness he had been carrying for 4 hours. Dumbledore held the boy with care that Hagrid did not have words for, but recognized. Sorry. That was the word underneath the care, sorry and certain, both at once. Dumbledore carried Harry up the porch steps. He set him on the doorstep with the letter tucked under the edge of his blanket, pressed the bell, and came back down the steps without looking back. He walked away along Privet Drive, and his boots made no sound on the pavement. A light came on upstairs. McGonagall remained at the garden gate. She had said everything there was to say about it, and it had made no difference, which was a particular kind of grief she wore very quietly, chin up and eyes forward, and expression giving nothing away to anyone who was not paying close attention. Harry slept through all of it. He slept through the patroness and the bell and Dumbledore's careful hands. He was 15 months old, and he was alive, and that was right now everything it needed to be. A slice of warm light fell across the doorstep. Something stirred and picked up the bundle, and the light went away again. McGonagall watched the curtains settle. Then she turned and walked in the other direction, and neither of them spoke, and the street was quiet, and Privet Drive went back to being exactly what it had always been, the sort of place where nothing happened. The flat had 3 rooms and almost nothing in them. This was by design, or rather by necessity, which was how most things in Remus Lupin's life arrived. Necessity dressed up as design, so that it was easier to live with. He had been here 4 months, which was longer than most places, and in 4 months he had accumulated a cot, a chair, a table, 2 plates, a chipped mug with a crack running from the handle to the base that he kept intending to replace, a small stack of books he'd read twice each, and a wizarding wireless that sat on the windowsill and was currently the loudest thing in a flat that was otherwise very quiet. He had not accumulated friends, or photographs, or the small objects people collected when they expected to stay somewhere. He had learned not to expect that outside November had arrived in the night. The light through the window was grey and watery, the kind that made everything look like it had been left out in the rain. He was sitting in the chair with his hands around the chipped mug, and he was doing the thing he had been doing since 3 in the morning when the wireless had woken him, listening to the jubilation and trying to feel something in it that was not grief. The war was over. Voldemort was gone. These were good things. He knew they were good things. James and Lily were dead. He had known for 6 hours, and he still could not hold that sentence still. Every time he reached for it, it moved slightly to the left or the right, never quite landing where a real thing was supposed to land. He had been awake all night with it, sitting in his chair with the wireless cycling through the same story in different voices, the same facts accumulating, and it was still not landing. James, Lily, Harry alive. No one had said where the Ministry was still processing the night, and the broadcast kept saying celebrating as though celebration were possible, as though it were not sitting in the same sentence as dead and Azkaban and Sirius. His hands tightened on the mug. The broadcast had been saying that for an hour now, underneath the jubilation, Sirius Black, in Ministry custody, accused of killing 13 people on a London street, accused of betraying the Potters to Voldemort, accused of serving the enemy. They had all spent the last years of their lives fighting. But Remus had sat with that for an hour, and it was still not landing either, and he could not decide whether that was because it was true or because it was too much truth at once. He set down the mug. He made himself think clearly, the way he had trained himself to think clearly, because emotion was a thing that happened to him, and clarity was a thing he chose. Sirius had proposed the secret keeper switch. That was the fact. He kept returning to. Sirius had gone to James and Lily, weeks ago, a month ago, whenever it had been, and had said, "I am too obvious a target. Use Peter instead. It will be safer. Trust me." Lily had trusted him. They had always trusted him, both of them, in the particular uncomplicated way that people trusted Sirius Black, which was entirely and without examining the terms of it, because Sirius had that quality about him, that brightness, that absolute assurance, and they had all mistaken it for trustworthiness when it had been perhaps something else entirely. Remus had trusted him too, but Sirius had known. That was the part Remus could not get around. Sirius was the only person who had known both pieces of information simultaneously, that he himself was not the secret keeper, and that Peter Pettigrew was. The only person in the world who could have walked up to Voldemort and said, "Here is the address, here is who holds it, here is how to reach them." The only person who had possessed both the knowledge and the motive, apparently. The motive that Remus had not seen, the whatever. It was that had been underneath all that brightness and assurance, and "I would die for you." The thing that turned out not to have been love, after all, but something he could not yet name. He had eaten off their plates, he had stayed in their house, He had held Harry. Remus stood up from the chair and walked to the window, not because there was anything to see there, but because sitting still had become impossible. The street below was quiet. Muggle Street, early morning, a few people moving on the pavement with their collars up against the cold. None of them knew. None of them knew that anything had happened at all, that a war had ended in the night, that James Potter was dead in a village in the West Country, that the people Remus had, the people stopped. He stood at the window with his hands in his pockets and his forehead almost touching the glass, and let the grief arrive, just for a moment, just enough to know it was there and then put it somewhere he could carry it, because the alternative was to stand at this window until he stopped standing, and he had things to do. He had to testify. He walked to the table, he sat down. He found paper and a quill in the drawer where he kept such things, and he uncapped the ink, and he sat looking at the blank page for a long moment. He would tell the truth. That was the only thing he knew how to do, with any consistency, and it had never yet killed him. And he was going to tell it now, even though every line of it would be the most damaging thing Sirius had ever faced from someone who had loved him. Because Remus had believed, with everything he had, that Sirius was the secret keeper. He had not been told otherwise. Nobody had told him. He had been kept outside that circle of knowledge, excluded. He understood now, probably to protect him, probably because Sirius had thought, Remus is too honest. Remus will not be able to carry a secret he's carrying. And that, perversely, was how Sirius had always known him best. He dipped the quill. I am writing regarding the case of Sirius Black, currently in ministry custody. I was not informed that the secret keeper of the Fidelius charm, protecting the Potter residence, had been changed. To the best of my knowledge at the time, Sirius Black was the designated secret keeper. I believe I was not informed of the change. He was about to write the next sentence. I am prepared to testify to this effect before any appropriate ministry body, when something made him stop. He read back what he had written. He read it again. Sirius had demanded Veritaserum. The broadcast had said that Pasquin Vi. It had said it, and he had heard it, and he had filed it somewhere behind everything else, because everything else was larger, and it had sat there for an hour in the part of his mind that catalogued facts without processing them, and now it surfaced. Not freedom. Not, I am innocent, don't send me there. Not even a fight, apparently. The report had said he had gone quietly. He had demanded Veritaserum. He had stood in a street full of dead people and asked for the potion that pulled the truth out of you, whether you wanted it to or not, and he had done it loudly enough that auras had put it on record. Remus sat with the quill in his hand and the ink drying on the nib, and thought about what kind of person demanded Veritaserum. A guilty man did not demand Veritaserum. A guilty man laughed, or fought, or said nothing. A guilty man did not publicly request the one thing that could confirm or destroy the story he was trying to protect. The only person who demanded Veritaserum was a person who either believed they could withstand it, which was possible, which was a real possibility he had to hold, or who had nothing to hide. He did not tear up the letter. He was not yet ready to tear up the letter. But he set down the quill and sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at what he had written, and thought about Sirius Black standing in a crater with 12 muggles dead and demanding the truth potion. It was not enough. It was one detail against everything else, and he did not know yet what to do with it. He left the letter where it was. He went to make another cup of tea. Outside, the grey November light moved over the rooftops of a muggle street that did not know anything, and the wireless cycled back to the beginning of the story. and Remus Lupin stood at his small window and waited to understand what he had just done and what he had almost done, and found that he could not yet tell the difference. The Ministry communication arrived on her desk on the 2nd of November, mid-morning, while she was correcting fourth-year essays on the switching spell with the focused displeasure such essays reliably produced. She set down her red quill when she saw the seal. It was official Ministry parchment, Department of Magical Law Enforcement, bearing the signature of Bartemius Crouch Sr. It informed her, in the measured and impersonal language of institutional authority, that Sirius Black was in Ministry custody pending a summary proceeding to be scheduled at the discretion of the head of the DMLE. It noted that, given the exceptional circumstances and the provisions of emergency wartime powers, a full Wizengamot trial had been deemed unnecessary. There was no mention of Veritaserum. There was no mention of any scheduled investigative session at all. She read it twice. She set it down. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk, looking at the wall of her office above the stack of ungraded essays, and then she stood and walked to Dumbledore's office. The stone gargoyle admitted her without a word. She took the spiral staircase in the deliberate, unhurried way she took all staircases, and knocked and opened the door. Dumbledore was at his desk. He looked up when she came in, and his expression arranged itself into the specific kind of attentive calm that she had learned over many years was not quite the same thing as surprise. He had half-moon spectacles on, and he was holding a letter she could not read from where she stood, and he set it down as she placed the Ministry notice on his desk between them. He made a formal demand, she said, in front of 6 Ministry auras on record, and Crouch intends to proceed as though the record does not exist. Dumbledore looked at the notice. He picked it up and read it, which took perhaps 20 seconds, and he set it back down with the care he gave to all documents, regardless of their contents. "I am aware," he said. "Then I am asking you to intervene. You are Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot. If anyone has the standing to object to Crouch's use of emergency powers in a case where a formal procedural demand has been Minerva." He said it with the same gentleness he had used at Privet Drive, which she had not forgotten and did not intend to forget. "I have a conflict of interest in this matter. You placed a child with his aunt." "I placed a child under the most powerful magical protection currently available to him. The conflict exists regardless of my reasoning, and I cannot petition on behalf of a man whose case intersects with a guardianship arrangement I have made." He paused. "The Ministry process will take its course." She looked at him. He did not quite meet her eyes, which was unusual enough that she noticed it, and noticing it, she understood. Dumbledore was a man who could look at almost anything directly. He had spent his life looking at difficult things directly, and the handful of occasions when he could not do so told her more than any number of words would have. He had placed Harry before the trial concluded. He had known about the demand when he placed him. She had been standing there when the Patronus arrived. She had watched his face in that pause. She had known then, and she knew now. A trial that exonerated Sirius Black was not merely a legal complication. It was a verdict that would arrive at Dumbledore's door and ask him to account for what he had done in the 3 seconds between receiving the news and finishing his letter. Quote, "And Dumbledore, who was prepared to account for almost anything, was apparently not quite prepared to make that accounting easy." "I see," she said. She picked up the Ministry notice from his desk. She walked out of his office and down the spiral staircase and through the stone arch at the bottom, and she did not stop moving until she had reached her own office, retrieved her coat and her bag, and walked to the Hogwarts gates from which she could apparate. She appeared in the Ministry of Magic atrium which was still carrying traces of last night's celebration in the form of abandoned streamers being cleared by a house elf with an expression of deep professional resignation. She did not pause to take in the scene. She walked to the lifts, pressed the button for level 2, and when the lift opened, she walked past the DMLE offices, past Croucher's office whose door was closed, and continued down the corridor to the smaller suite of offices at the far end, which bore a brass plate reading Wizengamot Administrative Services. The witch behind the desk was perhaps 40, with reading glasses that matched her manner. Businesslike, unhurried, and accustomed to people who arrived, believing their matter was uniquely urgent, McGonagall placed the ministry notice and the copy of the Aura's arrest documentation on the desk between them. A formal demand for Veritaserum, she said, was made publicly by the accused Sirius Black in the presence of 6 ministry Auras on the morning of the 1st of November. The demand was captured by a ministry documentation charm. I have the transcript here. She laid it on top of the other documents. The head of the DMLE has scheduled a summary proceeding which makes no reference to this demand. I am asking your office to confirm whether the demand constitutes a procedural matter of record and, if so, what the appropriate next step is. The witch behind the desk looked at the documents. She picked up the oral transcript first, because that was the correct order, and she read it with the focused attention of someone who was already calculating institutional implications. She set it down. She picked up the ministry notice. A formal demand of this kind, she said after a moment, made publicly in the presence of ministry personnel, does constitute a procedural matter of record. It must either be honored or denied with formal written justification. A denial is itself subject to administrative review. She looked at McGonagall over the transcript. The head of the DMLE's notice does not constitute a denial. It schedules a proceeding. The demand is in a state of procedural limbo, which means that before the summary proceeding can proceed, the demand must be resolved. This office has the authority to convene an administrative hearing to determine whether the demand should be honored. McGonagall said, "I would like you to do that." The witch made a note. She asked 2 questions: McGonagall's name, her official standing, and wrote down the answers, and when she had finished she stamped the document and told McGonagall that a hearing notice would be dispatched to all relevant parties before the end of the day. McGonagall thanked her, which was not a thing she did automatically, and walked back to the lifts. The hearing notice arrived on Bartemius Croucher's desk at 4:47 in the afternoon, which he would later describe to his assistant as the most precisely timed inconvenience of his professional career. McGonagall did not know what time it arrived, because by then she was back at Hogwarts in her office, the pile of 4th-year essays still waiting where she had left them, and she was sitting at her desk with her coat still on and her hands in her lap, and the particular stillness that settled over her when she had done everything she could do and would now have to wait to find out if it had been enough. Crouch read the notice his assistant later recalled. Without visible expression, he asked to be left alone with it for several minutes. When the assistant returned, he had drafted a response acknowledging the hearing, and he had done so in the same precise, controlled hand he brought to all correspondence. He could not overturn an administrative hearing convened by the Wizengamot Services Office without making that overturning the story, without making the denial of due process the story, on the 3rd day after the fall of Lord Voldemort, when the wizarding world was celebrating a victory and looking for its institutions to behave in ways that matched the occasion. He was Bartemius Crouch. He had standards for his work, and one of those standards, the one he least frequently articulated but never lost sight of, was that the story told about him at the end of his career should be: he was ruthless, yes. He was unsentimental, yes, but he was always in the ways that mattered correct. He signed the acknowledgement. He allowed it. He did not love that he allowed it, but he allowed it nonetheless. McGonagall took off her coat. She uncapped her red quill. She went back to the fourth-year essays. The work had been set in motion. The rest was no longer hers to do tonight. The courtroom in the basement of the Ministry of Magic was not built to be comfortable. That was the first thing you understood when you were brought into it in chains, not because it was actively hostile, not because it was cold or dark or designed to break you, but simply because comfort had never been a design consideration. It was a space built to process legal facts, and Sirius Black was, in the language of the Ministry of Magic on the 14th of November 1981, a legal fact to be processed. The chair was stone with iron manacles at the arms, and the manacles closed around his wrists when he sat down, with the particular automaticity of things that had done this 1,000 times and expected to do it 1,000 more. The room was circular, the benches rising in tiers above him, though today only a handful were occupied. Crouch at the high bench, flanked by 2 clerks and a ministry legal advisor, whose name Sirius didn't know. A court reporter in the corner with a self-inking quill that had been moving since the moment they brought him in. A potions official. A quiet, slight witch in ministry robes, seated at a small table to his left, on which sat a vial so small it might have held perfume if it had any color to it at all. It was colorless, odorless. He knew this because he had told them to do it, and he knew what he had told them to do. Crouch read from the administrative ruling in the measured, expressionless voice he apparently used for everything. The session was investigative in status only. Any testimony produced would be submitted to a corroborating investigation before any determination of its legal weight was made. This was explicitly not a trial. The accused might still be sentenced by the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement under emergency wartime powers. The demand made by the accused on the 1st of November had been received, and this session constituted the ministry's response to it. He looked up when he finished. "Do you consent to the administration of Veritaserum under these terms?" "Yes," Sirius said. A clerk placed a sheet of parchment in front of him. He signed it with his right hand, the manacle giving just enough slack for the purpose, and the clerk removed it, and Crouch nodded to the potions official. She came to him with the vial. 3 drops. He had known it would be 3 drops, because that was the standard dose, and he had asked for the standard dose, and he was not going to be the reason this didn't work. She tilted the vial over his water glass, and the drops fell in, and the water didn't change color or smell or do anything noticeable. And she stepped back, and he drank. It was not what he had expected. He had expected something like a blow, the particular violence of having truth extracted from you by chemical compulsion, the way he'd been told it felt by people who'd experienced it under duress. What he felt instead was a loosening, as though a fist he hadn't known he was clenching, somewhere between his ribs and his throat, in the place where the last 2 weeks had been living, slowly, without ceremony, opened. He was not unconscious. He was not impaired. He simply became unable to choose not to answer, which was different from being unable to choose at all, and the difference mattered, and he held on to it. He sat in the chair, with his hands in the manacles, and waited. Crouch's clerk read the first question from a prepared list in a voice so professionally neutral it might have belonged to a clock. "Were you the designated secret keeper for the Fidelius charm placed on the residence of James and Lily Potter?" "He had been," Sirius said, "originally. He had been the one they had intended to use. Why were you not the secret keeper at the time of the attack? Because he had persuaded them to switch, because he had gone to James and Lily and said, 'I am too obvious.'" Voldemort will come for me first, and when he does, he will either break me or kill me, and either way the secret ends. There use someone else, someone no one would suspect. Use Peter. The clerk's quill was moving. Were you the secret keeper when Voldemort came to Godric's Hollow on the 31st of October? He was not. Then who was? Peter Pettigrew. Peter Pettigrew had been the secret keeper. Peter had known the address of the cottage. Peter had been the only person capable of giving it to Voldemort, and Peter had given it, and James and Lily were dead, and Sirius, the loosening was still happening. Somewhere in his chest, Sirius had gone to find him. Not to flee, not to protect himself, but because he had thought he owes them his death, at least, if he cannot owe them anything else. The clerk asked, "Did you disclose the location of the Potter residence to Lord Voldemort or to any agent of Lord Voldemort?" He had not. "Did you serve as an agent or operative of Lord Voldemort at any time?" He had not. "Did you kill the 12 Muggle bystanders who died on the street where you were arrested?" He had not. Peter Pettigrew had killed them. Peter had pulled out his wand, concealed in his sleeve, which Sirius had not expected, and which told him something he was not yet ready to think about, and blasted the street apart from behind his own body, to create the evidence that Sirius had done it. Then he had cut off his finger. Then he had disappeared into the drain. There was a pause between questions. The court reporter's quill had slowed without stopping. "Did you loan your motorcycle to Rubeus Hagrid on the morning of the 1st of November?" He had. He had found Hagrid at Godric's Hollow. This was not quite right. Hagrid had found him, or they had found each other, or he had still been in the doorway of the cottage when Hagrid arrived. He didn't remember the order, and he had given him the motorcycle, because Hagrid needed to get Harry somewhere safe, and the motorcycle was the fastest thing Sirius had access to. He had not considered it a sacrifice. He had considered it the obvious thing to do, and then he had gone to find Peter on foot, because the obvious thing to do next was to find Peter, and he had found him, and he had watched him destroy 12 people and vanish, and he had not laughed. He said all of this because he could not choose not to say it, and there was something in the not choosing that felt unexpectedly like relief, like a door opening to a room that had been locked for 2 weeks and turned out to contain only truth, which was heavy, but which had edges and could be set down somewhere outside of himself. The clerk finished the list. He did not know how long it had been. 20 minutes. Perhaps 30. Time had moved differently while the potion was working, not slower or faster, but somehow more granular, each second arriving complete, and then moving on without the usual blurring at the edges. He became aware that the loosening was beginning to ease. The room was very still. Crouch had not moved during any of it. He sat at the high bench with the expression of a man who was doing his job, which was apparently to listen to information without letting any of it register on his face. When the clerk confirmed the list was complete, he said, "Investigative status. The record will be forwarded to the Auror Investigative Office for corroborating inquiry." He gathered his documents. This session, nobody in the room acknowledged what Sirius had just testified to. That was not Crouch's job today. His job was to receive the investigative record and pass it along, and he had done it with the efficient calm of a man who had no intention of letting you see any further into him than the surface of the work required. They returned Sirius to his cell, which was not Azkaban. He had not gone to Azkaban. He was in ministry holding a different category of misery, cleaner and less eternal. And when the door closed, he sat on the cot with his wrists in his lap and looked at the marks the manacles had left. He had not been believed. Not officially. Crouch had recorded the testimony and adjourned, and Sirius had no way of knowing what the Auror Investigative Office would do with a ministry record. He did not know if anyone would look at it or take it seriously or find it worth pursuing, but it existed. Outside of him, it had been witnessed and documented and placed into the machinery of an institution that had been trying to bury it. And whatever happened next, he was not the only person alive who knew the truth. He had not been able to give James anything. He had not been able to give Lily anything. He had been standing in the wrong place at the wrong time and had not seen what was in front of him until it was too late. But he had given this. He lay down on the cot. He did not sleep, but he stayed still, which was the closest he'd managed since the night everything had come down. It wasn't comfort. It was the stillness of a man who had nothing left to do but wait, and who had, for the first time, something worth waiting for. The street had been sealed since the morning of the first. 2 weeks on, it smelled of old smoke and blasted stone, and the Muggle liaison team had placed a Muggle-repelling charm at both ends of the block, so thorough that anyone approaching found themselves suddenly thinking of somewhere else they needed to be. Standard procedure. The lead investigator from the Auror office arrived at 8:30 on the 16th of November with a team of 3 and new instructions from the Wizengamot Administrative Services. The existing forensic catalogue was to be reviewed with specific attention to the possibility of animagus transformation. The instruction had come from a procedural record, which had come from a documented demand, which had come from a man in ministry holding who had asked for Veritaserum. The investigator had read the chain carefully. He had not expressed an opinion on it. He crouched at the edge of the crater, which had been preserved in its exact state under a stasis seal, and looked. The blast pattern was the first thing. He had looked at it on the 1st of November in the initial sweep, and had catalogued it as consistent with a high-powered offensive spell originating from the vicinity of the arrested subject. He looked at it again now with the supplemental mandate in mind, and then he called over the forensic specialist from the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes who had accompanied him. "Where did this originate?" he said. She crouched beside him. She had a detection instrument, a small, calibrated tool that read the residual magical signatures in stone and surface material, and she passed it over the crater's interior in a slow, methodical arc. "There," she said after a time. She pointed to a spot roughly 6 feet behind where the accused had been standing at the time of arrest. "The highest concentration of residual force is here. Not at the suspect's position." He looked at where she was pointing, 6 feet behind. And the accused had been at. He checked his notes against the first report, this point, which he indicated with his wand. The suspect had been forward of the origin. If the suspect had cast a spell of that magnitude in the direction of the blast, from that position, the returning force would have. He would have been inside the effective radius, the specialist said, before he finished the thought. A blast of this magnitude from that range cast toward this origin point. He would have been caught in it. He was not injured. No, he made a note. It was not proof. It was inconsistency, which was a different thing, and he was careful about the difference. He did not write in his notebook, "Sirius Black is innocent." He wrote, "Blast origin inconsistent with prosecution's account. Subject not within effective radius of origin. Requires explanation." He stood. He walked to the far edge of the cordoned area, where the pavement was cracked but intact, and found the evidence marker that had been placed over the physical remains on the 1st of November. Under the stasis seal, a single human finger, preserved precisely as it had been found. Adult male, the initial catalogue had noted. Severed, cleanly. No corresponding body, no other biological material. He had looked at this too, on the 1st of November, and had not thought much of it, because the working theory had been settled quickly and there had been other work. He looked at it now. One finger. The entire human remains at the scene were a single finger. If the suspect had killed 12 people with a single explosive curse and been standing at the site, there would be. He consulted the forensics section of his training. Biological material consistent with proximity. There was none. The 12 victims' remains had been documented in their entirety, and none of it was the suspect's. The suspect had been found at the scene alive and physically intact, with no injuries consistent with having cast or been caught by an explosion of this magnitude. He went back to his notebook. He did not write, therefore Peter Pettigrew staged this. He wrote, single severed digit, no corresponding body. Self-amputation pattern cannot be excluded. Condition of wound inconsistent with blast injury. The Animagus registry was his next stop. He returned to the ministry that afternoon and pulled the relevant records from the classification office on level 3. The Animagus registry for the United Kingdom, maintained under the provisions of the 1965 Animagus Registration Act, showed 7 legally registered human-to-animal transformers for the 20th century. He read through all 7 entries. None of them was Peter Pettigrew. None of them was Sirius Black. The registry was silent on both names. The absence of Pettigrew's name was the relevant fact for his current inquiry. If Pettigrew had been capable of assuming a rat form, and the registry showed no record of any rat form animagus for anyone on the current rolls, the transformation would have been unregistered, which was an offence under the 1965 Act. He wrote this down with care. No registered rat form animagus currently listed. Peter Pettigrew not found in registry. Sirius Black not found in registry. Hypothesis of unregistered animagus transformation at scene cannot be excluded on registry evidence alone. He noted Sirius Black's absence from the registry separately because it was a separate fact, and he was a thorough man and it would need to be addressed, and it was not the same as the question he was currently investigating. The Muggle witnesses were the last piece. It had been 2 weeks since the obliviations. Memory extraction on an obliviated subject was a delicate process, not impossible, but requiring a specialist from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's Memory Evidence Unit, and he had arranged for one. She worked through the morning of the 17th, pulling what remained from 2 of the witnesses who had been obliviated at the scene and whose testimonies had been taken initially for the Muggle police record and then sealed. The first witness had been standing approximately 30 meters from the epicontra. He had seen the explosion and had then, before collapsing from the shock of it, seen something moving through the rubble in the immediate aftermath. He described it as a large rat. He said, large, as though this required emphasis. Not a normal rat. Something considerably bigger than it ought to have been. It had gone into the drain at the far curb. He had not registered this as significant at the time, because a street had just exploded, and there was rather a lot of competing information. The second witness, from the opposite side of the street, said, a rat? Yes, running. The drain at the far end. She had noticed it because it had been moving away from the explosion, rather than in any direction you would expect from a startled animal away from. He sat with these testimonies for a time before he wrote anything. He was not a man given to dramatic conclusions. He had been in the Auror office for 6 years, and he had learned to hold evidence carefully, to let it tell him what it said, rather than what he wanted it to say. What this evidence said was specific and strange, and he wrote it down. 2 independent Muggle witnesses describe large rat exiting scene via drain at curb, moving purposefully away from explosion origin. Testimony independently produced through memory extraction. No direct contradiction between testimonies. He wrote the report that night. He was precise about what the evidence did not say. It did not say Sirius Black was innocent. It said the evidence of his guilt was not what the prosecution had assumed it was. It said there was a physical pattern at the scene. One finger, no body, a blast origin that required explanation, a drainer rat. That was consistent with an alternative account. It said the Animagus registry had a gap that was relevant to that alternative account. It said further inquiry was warranted. He submitted it to the presiding officer of the administrative session in the morning. The presiding officer read the report twice. He had been a Wizengamot member for 11 years, and he knew the difference between a report that said nothing and a report that said something carefully. This one said something very carefully. He filed it and sent a copy to the Aurora Division Chief with a note. The Animagus hypothesis requires further investigation before the summary proceeding can proceed. He did not send a copy to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. That was a distinction he made deliberately. Outside, 12 families were grieving people who had died on an ordinary morning, on an ordinary street, and did not know how. The ministry managed these things. The question was only whether this particular management had been done correctly, and the report suggested, without drawing conclusions, that it might not have been. The ministry summons arrived on the 22nd of November, which was 3 weeks after the night Remus had sat down at his table to write a letter. He was not sure he should send. The letter was still there. He had not sent it, and he had not torn it up, which had felt like the appropriate response to a situation he did not fully understand yet. He had read it several times since writing it, and each time it had said the same thing. I believed Sirius Black was the secret keeper. I was not told otherwise. I am prepared to testify to this. It was honest. It was entirely honest, which was the problem with it. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket when he left for the ministry. The atrium had shed most of its post-war jubilation by now. 3 weeks on, it felt like a ministry again, purposeful, self-important, the particular bureaucratic hum of an institution that had moved on to the next set of problems. He told the witch at the information desk he was here as a summoned witness, and she directed him to a corridor on level 10, and he rode the lift down, feeling the familiar sensation of an old building, processing him through its structures, and finding him as usual slightly unfamiliar. There was an anteroom outside the investigative hearing chamber. It had 6 chairs, 3 of which were occupied by other people who were not looking at each other, with the focused determination of people in waiting rooms everywhere. Remus took a chair, set his coat in his lap, and waited. He was perhaps 10 minutes in when a door at the far end of the corridor opened. Not his door, a different door, and 2 ministry officials came through it, and between them, in ministry restraints, was Sirius. He was turned half away, saying something to one of the officials, and the official was giving him the practiced non-response of a man who had decided not to engage. In the 3 weeks since his arrest, Sirius had not been to Azkaban. This was still ministry holding. Remus knew this from the broadcast, from the procedural coverage that had replaced the initial jubilant reports, and ministry holding was its own particular misery. But it was not Azkaban. He looked like himself, a version of himself. Thinner, a pallor under the dark complexion, the long hair tangled in ways that James would have found inexplicable and that Remus found briefly unbearable to look at, but himself. Still himself, Remus looked away before Sirius turned. He sat with his hands in his lap and did not think anything useful for the remaining 5 minutes until they called his name. The investigative panel was 3 people. A senior Auror, whose name Remus didn't know, a ministry legal advisor taking notes, and a Wizengamot administrative officer seated at the head of the table who was looking at Remus with the focused attention of someone who had read his preliminary letter. He told the same truth that was in the letter, in the same order, without embellishment. He had believed Sirius Black was the secret keeper. He had been told nothing to the contrary. He understood now that the arrangement had been changed. He had heard this from the Veritaserum testimony record, which had been made available to summoned witnesses in advance of the hearing. But he had not known it at the time. At the time, he had believed Sirius was the keeper, and he had believed, when Sirius was arrested, that this belief made him guilty. And that belief, the senior Auror said, was based on what? On the fact that I was never told otherwise, Remus said. Sirius came to me, to the rest of us, to the Order, and said he had proposed himself as the obvious choice for secret keeper, and that Dumbledore had agreed. He didn't tell me about any change, neither did James. I assumed the arrangement held. You assumed Sirius was lying when he said, I assumed nothing about whether he was lying, Remus said. I had no information one way or another. I only knew what I had been told, and what I had been told was that Sirius was the keeper. So when Sirius was arrested, the simplest explanation was the one that fit what I knew. He paused. The simplest explanation is not always the correct one. The Auror made a note. This testimony confirms the official account, she said, which was her way of noting it and moving on. Thank you. For there is something else, Remus said. She looked up. He stayed in his seat. He had not planned to stay in his seat, not consciously, but he had arrived here, knowing there was something else, had known it since the night he hadn't sent the letter, and the something else didn't become less true. Peter Pettigrew, he said. Specifically what Peter Pettigrew was capable of. He told them about Peter's animagus form, directly, without editorializing, in the order it had happened. The four of them, in their third year, deciding to become animagi. The process had taken 3 years. Peter had managed it eventually. A rat, small enough to be easily overlooked, which had always suited him well enough. None of them had registered the transformations. That was a violation of the 1965 Act, and he understood the implications. But the relevant implication here was different. If Peter could transform into a rat, Remus said, then a staged disappearance becomes possible. He was unregistered. No ministry record would have his rat form on file. If he cut off his finger, set off the explosion with his wand, and transformed, there would be no body, only the finger, and a rat in a drain. The room was quiet enough that he could hear the legal advisor's quill stop moving. A large rat, Remus continued. The witnesses who were obliviated at the scene. I don't know what their memories said, but I know what a man who has transformed into a rat looks like when he moves. It doesn't look like a normal rat. It is considerably larger, and it moves like something that knows where it's going. He stopped. He had said the thing. He had said all of it, and it was in the record now, and he did not feel heroic or righteous or like he had done something particularly courageous. He had told the truth. That was available to him, in the order it was available, which was the only thing he knew how to do with any consistency. Mr. Lupin, the Wizengamot officer said, was Peter Pettigrew's animagus status known to Sirius Black. Yes, Remus said. It was known to all of us. We were there when he achieved the transformation. He was excused. He retrieved his coat from the anteroom, which was now empty, and walked back to the lifts, and took them up to the atrium, and walked out of the ministry into a November street that was cold and grey, and entirely indifferent to what had just happened inside the building behind him. He sat on the low wall outside the visitor's entrance. Just for a moment. Just until the particular sensation in his chest, which was not relief, He didn't think and not grief, exactly, though it was adjacent to both, settled enough to carry. He had nearly contributed to his best friend's imprisonment. He had sat at his table for 3 weeks with a letter that said, in his own handwriting, I believed Sirius was the keeper, and he had almost sent it without the second part. And yet, he had not been told. That was the thing he kept returning to, sitting on the wall with his coat collar up against the November wind. He had not been told, and so he had assumed. And the assumption had felt like certainty, because it fit the information he had. Sirius had done the same thing, not told and assumed, and the assumption had nearly destroyed him. Both of them had trusted the wrong person. Sirius had trusted Peter and lost everything, and Remus had trusted his own conclusions and nearly lost Sirius, and the distinction between those two failures felt important, and also, right now, collapsed into something he could not find the edge of. He stood up from the wall. He pulled his coat tighter. He had more to do. There would be follow-up questions possibly, and he needed to think about the legal exposure from the Animagus disclosure, for himself and for Sirius and for the memory of James, who had been a stag. He had a great many things to think about. He walked. The street absorbed him. Around him, London went on, being London enormous and various, and entirely unaware of the procedural machinery turning over inside one of its less remarkable buildings, moving toward whatever it was going to produce. He hoped it would produce the right thing. He was aware that hoping was not the same as knowing, and that the difference mattered. He had been confusing the two for 3 weeks, and he was trying, very carefully, to stop. Dumbledore had been summoned before institutional bodies more times than he could readily count, and he had developed a particular relationship with the experience, careful and complete attention, the kind that lets you hear exactly what was being asked and respond to. He arrived at the ministry on the 26th of November by flu, stepped through in a sweep of powder-blue robes, and walked to the lifts without stopping. He did not wear his Wisengamot robes. He had come as a witness. His role as chief warlock was suspended for any proceeding connected to the Potter case on account of a conflict of interest he had disclosed formally and without being asked. The conflict was real. The fact that it was also convenient was a private observation he had not recorded anywhere. The hearing room was a smaller chamber on level 2. Administrative rather than criminal, with the lower ceilinged practical atmosphere of a room designed for paperwork rather than justice. The administrative officer sat at a desk at the far end. Minerva was there, in one of 4 chairs, arranged in a shallow arc, her expression carrying the quality of a woman who had already said what she had to say and was here to ensure it was heard again. He took the chair beside her without acknowledgement and waited. The administrative officer folded her hands. James Potter's will designated Sirius Black as godfather and proposed guardian. Dumbledore had placed Harry with Petunia Dursley on the morning of the 2nd of November, before any trial had concluded, before any formal determination of Black's legal status. Had he known of the will? Yes, Dumbledore said. Then you will understand why this hearing has been convened. I understand entirely, and I am prepared to explain the considerations that informed my decision, which I maintain were and remain. He placed his hands flat on his knees and told them about the blood ward. Lily Potter had died to save her son. She had not simply been killed, she had chosen death when she could have stood aside. And that choice had created a magical protection woven into the child's survival and anchored in blood. In Lily's blood specifically. In the body of the woman who had been Lily's sister, before she had been anything else, that blood was the anchor. The protection existed in the home where it was present. For as long as Harry lived in that home, in the care of that relative, the protection Lily had bought with her life would hold. It would not diminish. It would grow as Harry grew, until he came of age. There is no substitute, Dumbledore said. No combination of wards, no alternative location or guardian would replicate what is currently protecting this child. The blood ward is a single, specific, irreplaceable thing, and Mr. Sigrin— Black's godfather designation, the administrative officer said, cannot override this. Not because I would not permit it to, Dumbledore said carefully, but because the magic does not permit it. The magic is not asking for my opinion on the matter. It is a constraint, as real and as fixed as any other law of nature. Harry must live where Lily's blood is present for the protection to hold. You placed him under the protection, Minerva said. It was the first time she had spoken, and her voice was exactly what he had expected, precise, with the controlled temperature of a question that is also an accusation. I did, Dumbledore said, before the trial. Yes, while Sirius Black, the designated guardian, was alive and had not been convicted of anything. Dumbledore turned to look at her directly. While Sirius Black was in ministry custody on charges of murder and treason, he said, and while Harry Potter needed somewhere to be that night, not 3 weeks later when proceedings were concluded, the blood ward is time-sensitive. Every day Harry spent outside a home anchored in Lily's blood was a day. The protection was not establishing itself. I made a judgment about what was most urgent. Minerva's expression did not change in a way anyone else would have noticed, but he had known her for a long time, and he saw the small tightening at the corners of her eyes that meant she had heard the answer and found it insufficient and was deciding whether to say so. She decided. If Mr. Black is exonerated, she said, when the trial concludes, will you voluntarily support transferring guardianship to him? The question arrived with the particular clarity of a question that had been prepared in advance, that had been waiting in the room since before either of them entered it. He understood why she had asked it. He understood that it was fair and reasonable and exactly the right thing to ask, and that it required an answer he was not entirely certain how to give. The blood ward's requirements will not change, regardless of the trial's outcome, he said. He suspected Minerva heard it too, heard not only what he had said, but the shape of what he had not said, the clean avoidance of a yes or a no, wrapped in a truthful statement that had nothing to do with the question that had been asked. Professor Dumbledore, she said, I asked whether you would support the transfer of guardianship, and I have told you the blood ward's requirements, which govern any such transfer, regardless of my support or opposition. Those are not the same answer. No, he agreed, they are not. The administrative officer, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of a person who was adding it to a file, cleared her throat. Given the pending trial, she said, I am adjourning this session until a verdict is reached. If Mr. Black is convicted, the guardianship question is resolved. If he is exonerated, this session will reconvene to determine whether the placement at Privet Drive was made lawfully and whether a transfer of guardianship to the exonerated party is required. She made a note. Professor Dumbledore, I would ask you to remain available for reconvening on short notice. Of course, he said. He thanked the officer. He did not look at Minerva as he left. The corridor outside the hearing room was long and lit by the ministry's particular variety of magical illumination, which was technically adequate and aesthetically indifferent. He walked the length of it to the point where it branched toward the lifts, and then he stopped. He stopped in the corridor and let himself be still. He thought about Lily, not as a factor in a calculation as herself. He had not done that since the night it happened. He had a particular way of managing grief, learned over a very long life. Assign it to a place where it cannot interrupt the work, then attend to the work. He had become efficient at this. It had served him. It had cost him things he sometimes counted. Hagrid had said, "He's got her eyes." That was what he had said. Standing in the dark, with the child in his arms, Hagrid, who was incapable of subtlety, and for whom the world had a warmth most people could not access. "He's got Lily's eyes." Dumbledore had not looked. He had written a letter, he had placed the child on the step, and he had not looked, because the calculation was not wrong, and looking would have made it harder to execute, and the calculation remained not wrong. The protection was establishing itself in a house in Surrey right now. Harry was alive and defended. Whatever Sirius Black had or had not done, that much was true. And yet the voice that sounded like Minerva would not be quiet. It was not, in fact, Minerva's voice. It was something older, from the part of him that had been wrong before, and had had to stand afterward and acknowledge it. He was capable of that acknowledgement. He had done it. He was not certain he was capable of it here. He walked to the lifts. There were things he did not know about the investigation, about what the formal trial would reveal. He would wait. He would not resolve this in a ministry corridor on the basis of incomplete information. He recognized, pressing the button for the atrium, that this was exactly what he had told himself on the night he placed Harry on the step. It had been true. Then he was not certain whether its being true then made it true now. The lift arrived. He stepped in. They brought him up from the holding level at 9 in the morning, which was earlier than he had expected. A month in ministry custody had given Sirius a working familiarity with the institution's rhythms, and trials did not begin at 9. 9 was an inconvenient hour for a formal proceeding. He did not think this was accidental. The courtroom was the same one they had brought him to for the Veritaserum session. He recognized the stone chair before he saw the rest of it, the particular quality of a thing that is designed only for confinement, that has no other purpose, and makes no pretense of having one. He sat in it, and the manacles closed, and he looked up at the gallery. They were all there. 50 Wisengamot members in plum-colored robes, the silver W at each breast catching the courtroom's torchlight with the indifferent gleam of institutional embroidery. They filled the tiered benches on 3 sides. The effect was overwhelming, not in an aggressive sense, but in a sheer numerical one. 50 people, whose collective authority constituted the highest court in wizarding Britain. He looked back. He had decided, sometime in the past month, that he was going to look back. Crouch sat at the high bench. Not as presider, a senior Wisengamot member occupied the presiding chair today, because the structural impropriety of the head of the DMLE serving simultaneously as prosecutor and judge. He had his parchments arranged before him with the same precision Sirius had observed in the Veritaserum session, and he did not look at Sirius at all. The investigative panel's lead Auror presented the evidence record. He did it methodically, in the order it had been gathered, and he read from a written summary rather than from memory, which was a deliberate choice. Everything in the record, nothing outside it, no editorializing. Sirius had not seen this document before. He listened. The Veritaserum testimony, recorded on the 14th of November, the full account of the Fidelius switch, the secret keeper designation, Peter Pettigrew's identity as the true keeper, the street explosion, the finger, the drain, the motorcycle given to Hagrid before Sirius had gone to find Peter. The record was marked as investigative rather than court determinative, and the Auror noted this explicitly. The forensic analysis of the blast site, origin point established 6 feet behind the accused's position. The accused had been forward of that origin. A blast of that magnitude, cast from that range, would have placed him within its effective radius. He had arrived at the scene uninjured. The Auror noted that this was inconsistent with the prosecution's account and had not been adequately explained. The severed finger, sole human remains at the scene. No corresponding body, wound pattern, not consistent with blast injury. Self-amputation before transformation could not be excluded. The Animagus Registry, no registered rat form Animagus on record. Peter Pettigrew's name absent. Sirius Black's name absent. Noted separately. The testimony of Remus Lupin. He had believed Sirius was the secret keeper, had not been told of the switch, could confirm from personal knowledge that Peter Pettigrew had been capable of transforming into an unregistered rat, Animagus, having been present when Pettigrew first achieved it. The motorcycle, documented as having been lent willingly by the accused to Rubeus Hagrid on the morning of the 1st of November, before the accused's encounter with Pettigrew. The accused had then proceeded on foot to find Pettigrew. This was not the behavior of a man attempting to flee. The Auror concluded his presentation and sat down. The gallery was quiet. Crouch rose. His prosecution was not reckless. Sirius had not expected it to be reckless, and it wasn't. It was the most rigorous version of a case that could be built from the materials available. And the materials available were individually weak, and Crouch knew it, and he argued accordingly. Veritaserum testimony was not court determinative. This was established law, not a prejudice. The ministry had made a deliberate decision to limit Veritaserum's legal weight precisely because a substance that compelled speech could not guarantee accuracy, only compulsion. Whatever the testimony said, it could not constitute proof. The forensic blast analysis was inconclusive. The Auror had said the accused would have been within the effective radius. He had not been injured. These two facts. But the blast had been enormous, affecting a radius that covered an entire street, and the accused had been standing at the edge of the documented area of effect, and blast radius science was not an exact art. The analysis was suggestive, not decisive. Lupin's testimony about Pettigrew's Animagus form was unverifiable. There was no registry entry, no physical evidence of a transformation at the scene, only the personal knowledge of a man who had every reason to want his friend innocent. Crouch did not attack Lupin's honesty directly. He noted it and argued around it. Personal knowledge, however sincere, was not forensic confirmation. The war emergency, Crouch said, had not ended. The Wizengamot had a responsibility to resist the temptation of doubt in cases where collaboration with the enemy had been, for months, considered settled fact. He was correct about the individual weaknesses. Each piece, taken alone, had a legitimate answer. Sirius understood this and sat in the chair and waited, because there was one more thing. Would the accused like to address the Wizengamot? The presiding official's voice was neutral. Sirius looked up. Yes, he said. He did not stand. The chair did not permit it. He looked at the 50 members in their plum robes, and he said, I proposed the switch to Peter because I thought I was too obvious a target. I thought Peter would be safe. I was wrong. That is the only crime I actually committed, being wrong about who I trusted. Peter Pettigrew killed those 12 people, framed me for it, and is alive in rat form somewhere in the sewers of London. If you convict me, he wins twice. He stopped. That was the whole of it. He did not add anything. The record had already said the rest. He had made a decision sometime in the past month that the person who faced whatever came next was going to be the same person who had demanded this in the first place. Deliberate, clear, looking back. The gallery voted in the old way. Right hand raised for guilty, left for acquittal, the count recorded by the court clerk. It was not unanimous. Sirius watched hands go up on both sides and did not count, because counting would have made the space between the question and the answer feel smaller than it was, and he did not want it to feel smaller. He wanted to hold the space open for as long as it existed. Not guilty on the 12 counts of Muggle murder. Not guilty on the charge of treason against the wizarding community. Guilty on the charge of operating as an unregistered animagus, contrary to the Animagus Registration Act 1965, as disclosed under his own Veritaserum testimony. The courtroom did not react, not in any of the ways a room full of people could react when a verdict was delivered. Not with sound, not with movement, not with visible emotion. It produced something that was not quite silence and not quite stillness. It was the particular quiet of 50 people, absorbing the fact that they had come very close to something they did not want to examine directly. The presiding official read the sentence for the animagus charge. 1 year's probation, mandatory registration with the ministry's animagus registry. No imprisonment. The accused was free to leave the ministry. Sirius looked at Crouch when this was read. Crouch was looking at his notes. He did not look up. He had the appearance of a man who was working through the next item of business, for whom this proceeding had already concluded, and what remained was paperwork. Sirius looked at him for the duration of the sentence reading, and then looked away, because what he felt was not satisfaction, not vindication, not any of the clean and uncomplicated things he might once have expected to feel. He felt the way he had felt in the cell after the Veritaserum session, the stillness of a man who had done the thing and was now waiting to find out what the thing had cost and what it had bought. They removed the manacles. Someone handed him his wand in the corridor outside the courtroom. He stood in the Ministry of Magic hallway with the wand in his right hand and the plum-colored robes of the Wisengamot filing past him on both sides, and nobody spoke to him, and he did not speak to anyone. He had one question. It had been the only question, really, since the beginning. He had just not been in a position to ask it. He stopped the nearest clerk. "Harry Potter," he said. "Where is he?" The clerk was a young woman with the professionally blank expression of a ministry employee who had learned early not to react to what she was asked, and she answered his question the way she would have answered a request for a departmental memo, clearly, factually, without editorializing. Harry James Potter is in the care of his maternal aunt, Petunia Dursley, at 4 Privet Drive Ive, Little Winging, Surrey. The placement was arranged by Albus Dumbledore on the 2nd of November. "Thank you," Sirius said. He stood in the level 10 corridor with the Wisengamot filing past him, and held that answer. Lily's sister. He had met Petunia Dursley once, briefly, and had thought, this is nothing like Lily. He had not mentioned this to James, because there had seemed to be time. He did not go to Privet Drive. Not yet. The first thing was Dumbledore. Dumbledore had made this decision. He knew that from the administrative hearing record and from the plain arithmetic of who had the authority and inclination to place a child there, and Dumbledore should be required to say it to his face. He apparated to Hogsmeade and walked to the school in the specific state he had been learning to maintain for the past month, deliberate, present, looking at the thing and not around it. McGonagall was waiting outside the gargoyle. This had not been a coincidence, he gathered. She had known he would come, and had arranged to be here when he did. And the expression on her face was not surprise, but a complicated version of readiness. "How long have you been here?" "An hour." She paused. "I requested to be present for this conversation." He agreed. He nodded. They went up together. Dumbledore's office was warm and full of the particular industry of the space. Instruments rotating on their spindles, the portraits in their frames showing the alert half-attention of people listening without appearing to listen, the phoenix dozing on its perch. Dumbledore was standing rather than seated, which Sirius registered as a small courtesy. He was not behind the desk, not elevated by furniture. He was simply there, in the middle of the room, and his blue eyes were steady above the half-moon spectacles. "Sirius," he said, "I'm glad you are free, are you?" It came out flatter than he intended. He continued, "Because you put Harry in Petunia Dursley's house before I had a trial, before anyone knew whether I was guilty or innocent. You are his headmaster for a significant portion of his annual life, or you will be, and you placed him there, knowing you were not next of kin, not the designated guardian, not anyone James and Lily asked to make decisions for their son. I was aware of all of this," Dumbledore said. "Then I want to understand why you thought it was your decision to make." "Because no one else was in a position to make it that night," Dumbledore said, and his voice was as calm as the room. And the calm was not performance. Sirius knew the difference, had spent a year of order meetings reading it, and this was not performance. You were in ministry custody, the question of your guilt was open. James and Lily were dead. Harry needed somewhere to be that night, and the somewhere he needed was not a question of preference or sentiment. It was a question of magical fact. The blood ward, Sirius said. Yes, he had expected this. He had been expecting it since the clerk's answer in the corridor, since before that. Since he had read the administrative session transcript and seen Dumbledore's argument laid out in clean institutional language. He had spent the walk from Hogsmeade thinking about it, and he had conclusions, and he was going to give them in the same order he had arrived at them. "I know about the blood ward," he said. "I know what Lily's sacrifice created, and I know what it requires. I have spoken to people who understand this kind of magic, and I understand the argument. I'm not here to tell you the blood ward isn't real." He stopped. He started again more carefully. "I am not asking you to put Harry in danger. I am asking you not to put Harry in a house where he is not loved, on the basis of a magical theory, when he has a living, designated guardian who loves him. There has to be another way." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "A designated guardian who, 2 months ago, was in a ministry-holding cell on murder charges. A designated guardian who is currently standing in your office and has been exonerated by the Wizengamot." He felt the heat of it and kept his voice level because the argument was better level. "The circumstances that made the placement look like the only option don't exist anymore. What remains is a magical constraint that I am willing to discuss and work around, and a child who has been living for 2 months in a house, with a woman who resented his mother, and a man who doesn't know anything about magic, and presumably didn't ask to have a toddler left on his step. The blood ward cannot be worked around," Dumbledore said. "That is precisely the constraint. It is not a preference. It is a magical fact, the same way that water is wet and the killing curse cannot be blocked with a shield charm. It does not yield to alternatives. But it yields to conditions," Sirius said. "It requires Harry to live there. Does it require him to live there permanently, every day? What if Petunia is willing to have him for a month, a year, for the summers, enough to maintain the anchor? Because that is a different question, and it is a question I am willing to negotiate on, if there is actual negotiation happening, and not a decision that was made on the 1st of November and has not moved since." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment with the blue eyes that were simultaneously kind and severe, which was a combination Sirius had always found slightly exhausting, and he said, "There may be room in the conditions." "There is room in the conditions," McGonagall said. Both of them turned. She had been standing near the door, which was where she had positioned herself when they came in, and where she had remained throughout, and she had not spoken until this moment. Her voice carried the particular quality of a woman who had been deciding whether to speak and had made the decision. "I have spent the past month reading everything available on sacrificial blood protection," she said. "The blood anchor does not require continuous residence. It requires a meaningful period of residence each year. The lowest credible estimate is 6 weeks. She looked at Dumbledore. "A month? Each summer is within that range. It would preserve the ward." The room was quiet. "Albus," she said, and her voice shifted, still precise, still McGonagall, but the word carried something heavier. "He's been in that house for 2 months. He has a Remus Lupin, he has people who want him. The blood wards are not the only thing that can protect a child." Dumbledore took off his half-moon spectacles. He held them by one arm and looked at the floor, and Sirius watched him. Watched the particular stillness of a man who was doing something privately that he would not name aloud and who had the dignity not to perform it. "The administrative session will reconvene," Dumbledore said finally. "It is their authority to rule on the guardianship question, not mine. I will not obstruct it." He put the spectacles back on. "I would ask Sirius, whatever the ruling, that you consider the condition Minerva has described, a defined summer period, enough to maintain what Lily made." "I'll consider it," Sirius said. He meant it. That was the thing about the past month. It had clarified what he was willing to fight for and what he was willing to be reasonable about, and he was not going to ruin Harry's protection out of anger at the man who had, however imperfectly, tried to preserve it. "When the hearing rules," Sirius said. "I want to see him the same day." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "I think that is right." Sirius walked out without shaking hands because he was not ready for that yet, and he thought Dumbledore probably understood. He found McGonagall had followed him to the corridor. "6 weeks," he said. "That's the minimum. I'd recommend pushing for 4 in the summers. When Harry is old enough, you can explain it to him. He would push for 4. He would agree to 6 if he had to." He walked out into the December cold and started for Hogsmeade. The whole way there, he was doing arithmetic, not about numbers, but about what was possible and what he was going to build and who he was going to ask to help him. He had a list of 1 name so far. That was enough to start. The administrative session reconvened on the 8th of December and took 40 minutes to reach a conclusion that felt, in retrospect, like the only conclusion available to a body that had spent the previous 6 weeks reading its own procedural history. The ruling was this: Sirius Black, as the named and exonerated godfather, held prior legal claim under Wizarding family law. Dumbledore's interim arrangement had been made in good faith and without malice. Guardianship transferred. The administrative officer read the ruling in the same measured voice she had used throughout the entire preceding weeks of hearings, and then she set down the parchment and the session ended. The condition came immediately after, as Dumbledore had said it would. It was presented to the session in writing, which was Dumbledore's way of making it formal, and therefore harder to dismiss. Harry James Potter were to spend no fewer than 4 weeks of each calendar year in the home of Petunia Dursley at 4 Privet Drive, Ive, Little Whinging, sufficient to maintain the bloodward anchor created by Lily Potter's sacrificial protection. The period to be observed each summer, when Harry was old enough to travel. A ministry-certified magical agreement binding on both parties for as long as the ward remained active. Sirius read the document twice in the corridor outside the session chamber, sitting on a bench with his elbows on his knees, and said nothing. He went home to the rented flat above a wizarding apothecary in a Diagon Alley side street that he had taken 3 days ago for reasons that were primarily logistical and secondarily emotional. And he sat at the kitchen table with the document until it was dark outside, and then he slept, and in the morning he signed it. Not because he was happy with it, because the alternative was to leave Harry less protected than Lily had made him, and he would not do that. Whatever else he and Dumbledore were to each other, whatever accounting remained between them, Harry's safety was not a field where pride had any business operating. He signed it. He sent it. He sent a copy to Petunia Dursley with a brief, correct letter that said nothing warm and made no promises about warmth. She replied. Within the week, a single paragraph in a handwriting he recognized from school stationery as belonging to someone who had been taught to write neatly and had complied. She would honor the arrangement. She expected it to be honored in return. It was not a reconciliation. It was exactly as it needed to be, an agreement. The flat had 2 bedrooms, the smaller of which he had spent 2 days converting from a storage room into something that might be described as a child's room, if you used the term generously. He had bought a cot and a set of bedding with a pattern of small stars on it, because the pattern had reminded him of something, and he hadn't been able to identify what until he was on the way home and realized it was the Hogwarts ceiling on a clear night, and he'd felt briefly idiotic and then decided it was fine. His mother was alive and at Grimmauld Place, and he was not going to bring Harry anywhere near Grimmauld Place. That was not a complicated decision. The rented flat above the apothecary smelled of willow bark and something faintly sulphurous from the shop below, and had a view of a brick wall and a very small piece of sky, and was entirely satisfactory. He had negotiated a 6-month lease with the option to extend. He would figure out what came next when it arrived. He collected Harry from Privet Drive on a Tuesday afternoon in the 2nd week of December. Petunia opened the door with the expression of a woman who had agreed to do a thing and was doing it, and did not intend to discuss the doing of it, and she set Harry on the step with the particular efficiency of someone handing over a parcel they had been minding temporarily. Harry was wearing a blue knitted jumper 2 sizes too large and had what appeared to be porridge in his hair, and he looked at Sirius with Lily's green eyes from under James's dark mess of it, and grabbed the doorframe with both hands. "Hello," Sirius said. Harry studied him. He had 19 months of opinions about the world, and he was visibly forming one now. Sirius crouched down to his level. He held out his hand, not to be taken, but just to be there, available, while Harry made his assessment. Harry looked at the hand. He looked at Sirius's face. He appeared to reach some internal determination, and then he stepped forward off the doorstep and put both fists into Sirius' hair and pulled. The laugh came out of him before he could stop it. He hadn't planned it, and it bore no resemblance to the sound he had produced on a London street 6 weeks ago. That had been what grief produced when it had nowhere else to go and no other form available. This was something different. This was what came after. He laughed, and Harry, apparently delighted by this response, pulled harder, and Sirius straightened up with Harry in his arms and his eyes doing something that was entirely involuntary, and he did not look back at the doorstep to see if Petunia was watching. He went home. The flat in the afternoon was a domestic shambles of the specific kind produced by a 22-year-old who had never lived alone for any sustained period, and who now had a toddler and no useful precedents. There were books on every surface. There was a snitch in the kitchen that Harry had somehow got hold of and that kept ricocheting off the walls. There was a cot in the 2nd bedroom and a chair beside it, and a photograph of James and Lily on the shelf above it, which Sirius had put there because Harry should be able to see their faces, and had then stood looking at it for a long time with his hand on the shelf before going to make tea. He was putting Harry to bed, a process that involved considerable negotiation and a story that Sirius improvised from the beginning, because he couldn't remember any stories from his own childhood that were remotely appropriate when there was a knock at the door. He did not know who he expected. The knock had the quality of a person who was not sure they had the right to knock and was doing it anyway. Remus was standing in the doorway in a coat that had seen better decades, and with the expression of a man who had walked up the stairs and was now standing here and would understand completely if the door opened and then closed again. Sirius looked at him. He had not spoken to Remus since before any of this had happened, since before the war ended, before the arrest, before the trial. They had been in the same room once, the hearing, where Remus had sat across a ministry table and told the truth about all of it, including the parts that had initially been damaging and the part that had not been. He had been told. That was the thing. He had not been told, and he had assumed, and the assumption had been honest, and then he had sat in his chair and said there is something else, and the something else had mattered. Sirius opened the door wider. "There's no milk," he said. "Harry ate all the biscuits. If you want tea, you'll have to go back out." Remus went back out. He came back with milk and a packet of digestives, and the expression of a man who had been given a task and completed it, and was now standing in a kitchen that smelled of willow bark and whatever a 19-month-old's hair smelled like, and was not sure what to do with his hands. He sat at the table. Sirius put the kettle on. Harry, who had not been successfully put to bed, sat on the kitchen floor and investigated Remus's shoelaces with great seriousness. Remus looked down at him. He was not saying anything. He was doing the thing Remus did when he was feeling something large, which was to become very still and very careful, as if moving too quickly might dislodge it. Sirius poured the tea. He sat. He thought about what Dumbledore had said when he'd agreed to the condition, not in so many words, but in the quality of the way he'd said, "The threat is real and unfinished," in the door that was latched but not locked. He did not know what Dumbledore knew that he wasn't saying. He didn't know if Dumbledore knew it clearly, or was only sensing it the way old people sensed things, the instinct that the world had a shape it hadn't fully revealed yet. He only knew that something had been implied, and he had heard it. And it lived now, in the back of his mind, in the place where things lived, that you had to carry, but not always look at. For now, there was this, the kettle cooling, the digestives open on the table, Harry methodically untying Remus's shoe with the focused patience of an infant who had no conception of how long things were supposed to take. Remus was reading the label on the milk bottle with the careful attention of a man who was very deliberately not crying. This, Sirius thought,